A widowed millionaire saw a beggar woman embracing a small coffin on the roadside in the rain. But when he approached to help her, he trembled upon noticing the same scar on her forehead that his deceased wife had. The hospital hallway echoed with the sound of Rick's nervous footsteps. A 25-year-old man with always well-combed brown hair and green eyes that now reflected deep anxiety. His hands trembled as he adjusted the dark suit he was wearing for what should have been the happiest day of his life. The delivery room had remained closed for hours, and each passing minute seemed like a torturous eternity. The strong smell of disinfectant permeated the air, mixing with the aroma of flowers he had brought for Susan, his black-haired wife with a sweet smile, who was now fighting for her life on the other side of that white door. "Please let everything go well with my Susan and our baby. I cannot lose them now," Rick muttered to himself, closing his eyes in a silent prayer. The hours dragged on with cruel slowness as Rick walked incessantly through the cold hospital corridor. His footsteps had created an invisible path on the shiny linoleum, a trail of anxiety that he traversed repeatedly like a desperate ritual. Other family members waited in silence, some crying softly, others praying with rosaries between trembling fingers. Every 15 minutes, a nurse rushed by with medical equipment, and Rick followed her with his eyes, hoping she would stop to give news about Susan. The young husband had memorized every crack in the wall, every stain on the ceiling, every sound that echoed through the endless corridors of that place that smelled of hope and despair in equal parts. "Susan, my darling, you need to be strong now. Our baby needs to meet the most wonderful mother in the world," he whispered, touching the golden wedding ring that shone on his ring finger. An elderly nurse in an impeccable white uniform approached him with a maternal expression that tried to hide her own concern. Her grey hair was tied in a tight bun, and her calloused hands betrayed decades of experience in these corridors, full of human drama. She had witnessed miraculous births and devastating losses, and her professional intuition had already captured the worrying signs emanating from the delivery room where Susan was fighting for 2 lives. The clock on the wall marked almost 6 hours since labor had begun, a time that exceeded all normal expectations for a young and healthy first-time mother like Susan. "Mr. Rick, why don't you sit down and have some coffee? It might still take a while and you need to keep your strength," she suggested with a gentle voice. "Your wife will need you whole when this is all over." Rick stopped walking and looked at the nurse with eyes glazed by emotional exhaustion. His clothes were wrinkled, his tie loosened, and a thin stubble was beginning to appear on his usually well-shaven chin. He had left home that morning radiant as a man about to become a father, and now felt like a castaway, lost in an ocean of medical uncertainties. Susan's contractions had begun at dawn, gentle and regular like ocean waves, but then became violent and irregular, transforming what should have been a natural process into a battle for survival. The nurse observed how he repeatedly clenched and unclenched his fists, a classic sign of extreme stress that she had seen in thousands of anxious parents throughout her career. "I can't stop moving," Rick confessed, his voice hoarse from whispering prayers. "If I stop, I feel like something terrible will happen to them." On the other side of the door, muffled screams of pain occasionally echoed, each sound piercing Rick's heart like a sharp dagger. Susan, his sweet Susan, who hummed while cooking and never complained even of a simple headache, was suffering in a way he couldn't even imagine. He remembered how she had held his hand the night before, her brown eyes shining with expectation and a little natural first-time fear. She had whispered how eager she was to see the baby's little face, how she wanted to tell bedtime stories and teach first words. With each scream that crossed the door, Rick felt as if a part of his soul was brutally torn away, leaving open wounds that bled hope and terror in equal measure. "Susan, my love, be strong for both of us. You are the bravest woman I know," he repeated mentally, as if his words could penetrate the walls and reach the heart of the one he loved more than life itself. Finally, the door opened with a dry creak that echoed through the corridor like a cannon shot. The doctor who emerged was a middle-aged man with a graying beard and a somber expression that immediately made Rick's blood freeze in his veins. His hands were still covered by surgical gloves stained with red, and the weariness in his eyes betrayed hours of a medical battle that had become a lost war against time. Dr. Williams was known for his competence and professional coldness, but at that moment, His emotional defenses seemed to have been eroded by the gravity of the situation he had just faced. The doctor removed his surgical mask with slow and deliberate movements, revealing a face marked by the sadness of someone who needs to deliver bad news that will completely destroy another human being's life. "Mr. Rick," he said, his voice laden with a weight that seemed to crush every word even before leaving his mouth. "I need to talk to you about your wife, Susan, and about the complications we faced during childbirth." Rick felt his legs weaken, as if they had turned to jelly, and the entire corridor seemed to spin around him in a macabre dance of fluorescent lights and distorted shadows. His hands gripped the back of the blue plastic chair with desperate force, his knuckles turning white as if he were hanging from the edge of a precipice. The world around him seemed to have lost all colors, transforming into a black and white film, where only the sound of his own irregular breathing could be clearly heard. Dr. Williams moved closer, his expression trying to balance the medical need to be direct with the human compassion to soften the devastating impact of his words. The silence that settled between them lasted only a few seconds, but to Rick, it seemed an eternity of agony suspended in time. "Please, doctor, tell me Susan is okay," he begged, his voice coming out as a strangled whisper. "Tell me I'll be able to hug her and take her and our baby home today." Dr. Williams lowered his eyes for a moment, gathering courage to utter the words that would forever change the life of the young man standing before him. His decades of medical experience had taught him that there is no gentle way to announce a tragedy, that the raw truth always hurts less than prolonged false hope. He had witnessed the birth of thousands of healthy babies, but had also faced complications that defied all modern medical science, situations where not all the technology in the world could overcome the relentless forces of nature. Rick remained motionless, holding his breath as if this could suspend time and prevent the fatal words from being pronounced. The doctor placed a paternal hand on the young father's shoulder, feeling through the fabric of the suit how Rick's entire body trembled with an intensity that betrayed the absolute terror taking over his soul. "Mr. Rick," Dr. Williams said with a grave and measured voice, "I regret to inform you that your wife Susan did not survive the severe complications that arose during labor. We did absolutely everything within our medical reach, but the circumstances became irreversible." Rick couldn't contain his pain, and a cry of despair echoed through the hospital corridors. He collapsed into the chair with such force that the plastic furniture creaked under his weight, and his hands covered his face in an instinctive gesture of protection against a reality he refused to accept. Tears sprang between his fingers like springs of pure pain, wetting his palms and running down his neck in saline streams that carried with them all the dreams and plans he had built with Susan. Dr. Williams remained there, respecting the moment of absolute despair that every man has the right to experience when losing the most important person in his life. The elderly nurse approached discreetly, bringing a cup of water and some tissues, her own eyes welling up with compassion for the young man who had just had his world destroyed in a matter of seconds. "Susan, my dear Susan," sobbed Rick between his fingers, "how will I live without you? How will I breathe without the air you gave me every day?" After a few minutes that seemed like hours, Rick raised his swollen and red face to face the doctor, who was still there, patiently waiting for him to compose himself enough to hear the rest of the necessary medical information. His hopes desperately clung to the possibility that at least the baby had survived, that a part of Susan would continue living through the child they had planned with so much love and expectation. Dr. Williams read the question in Rick's red eyes before it was even formulated into words, and his heart contracted painfully upon realizing that he would still have to destroy the last spark of hope that remained in that shattered man. Rick got up staggering, clutching the doctor's arm like a shipwreck victim, holding onto a floating piece of wood amid a furious storm. "And our baby, doctor?" he asked with a trembling voice. "Please tell me they managed to save our child." "Susan would give her life 1,000 times so that our child could live. And I know she would want me to care for the baby, with all the love she felt for both of us." The silence that followed was more devastating than any word could ever be. An absolute vacuum that sucked all remaining hope from Rick's heart like an emotional black hole. Dr. Williams shook his head slowly, his experienced eyes reflecting the deep pain of having to completely destroy the life of a man who had already lost half his reason for existing. Rick felt as if the ground had literally opened beneath his feet, creating an infinite abyss where he plummeted in free fall through successive layers of despair and disbelief. The hospital corridor transformed into a distorted tunnel where only the echo of his own irregular breathing could penetrate through the deafening roar of his own mental agony. The doctor's words reached him as if coming from very far away, muffled by the emotional storm that had taken over all his senses. "I deeply regret, Mr. Rick," said Dr. Williams, his professional voice failing for the first time in decades of career. "The complications were fatal for both. The child couldn't survive the traumas of the prolonged labor. We did everything modern medicine allows, but unfortunately it wasn't enough to save them." Rick collapsed again, this time not even managing to stay seated in the chair, sliding onto the cold hospital floor, where he remained kneeling like a penitent before an altar of absolute pain. His entire body shook with a violence that seemed to come from within his bones, as if every cell in his organism was screaming in protest against that unacceptable reality. Dr. Williams and the nurse knelt beside him, offering the only possible comfort at that moment, a silent human presence in the face of a tragedy that transcended any word of consolation. The flowers that Rick had brought for Susan were scattered on the floor, their colorful petals creating a cruel contrast with the absolute darkness that now dominated his soul. He picked up a red rose, Susan's favorite flower, and pressed it against his chest, the physical pain being insignificant compared to the emotional tsunami devastating his interior. "I should have died in their place," he moaned, rocking his body back and forth in an ancestral rhythm of mourning. "I should have been strong enough to protect them from any harm that could threaten them." The next days passed like a sequence of interwoven nightmares, where Rick moved through a ghostly existence that he couldn't accept as real. His house, which previously echoed with Susan's crystalline laughter and her enthusiastic plans for the baby, now transformed into a silent mausoleum where each familiar object became a weapon of emotional torture. The light wooden crib that he had assembled with such care was still in the room that would have been the baby's, surrounded by colorful toys and tiny clothes that Susan had chosen with tears of joy in her eyes. The nursing chair where she planned to feed the child during the early hours remained there like an empty throne, awaiting a queen who would never return to claim her realm of maternal love. Rick spent hours sitting in that chair, imagining what it would be like to hear the baby's night cries, what it would be like to change diapers at 3 in the morning, what it would be like to teach first steps in the garden that Susan had planned to transform into a playground. "Susan, my eternal love," he whispered to the emptiness, "our baby would be walking through the corridors of this house, filling every corner with laughter and mischief that would make us smile even on the hardest days." The kitchen transformed into the most painful altar of his memories, where the spices that Susan used to create her special recipes still exhaled aromas that instantly transported him to happy mornings of shared coffee and whispered plans about the future. Her floral apron still hung on the pantry hook, stained with flour from the last pie she had made before going to the hospital, an apple dessert she wanted to prepare to celebrate the baby's arrival. Rick touched that fabric as if it were a sacred relic, still feeling the soft texture that had embraced Susan's body during so many moments of domestic happiness. The pots and pans she handled with the skill of a professional chef now remained cold and empty, like musical instruments silenced by the absence of the maestro who knew how to extract the most beautiful culinary symphonies from them. "I transformed simple ingredients into feasts worthy of kings, my darling," he whispered, opening jars of seasonings that still held the aroma of the last meals she had prepared. "And now I can't even boil water without remembering how you danced around this kitchen, humming old songs while creating gastronomic miracles." The couple's bedroom became an untouchable sanctuary where Rick preserved every detail exactly as Susan had left it on that fateful morning when they departed for the hospital. Her perfumes were still arranged on the dressing table, next to the hairbrushes that still held black silky strands between the bristles. Her clothes remained organized in the closet with the military precision she always maintained, each piece folded and hung with the care of someone who planned to wear everything again after giving birth. The bed still preserved the shape of her small, delicate body on the mattress, an almost imperceptible depression that Rick caressed every night before lying down on the left side, leaving the right side eternally reserved for the wife who would never return. On the nightstand, the last book Susan was reading remained open to the page where she had stopped, marked with a romantic postcard Rick had given her on their last wedding anniversary. "My beloved, I still smell your scent impregnated in the sheets," he confessed to the wedding photograph he kept beside the bed. "I still wake up in the middle of the night expecting to hear your soft breathing beside me. I still reach out my hand, seeking the warmth of your body that warmed my soul." As months turned into years, Rick developed a meticulous routine of preserving Susan's memories, as if he could keep her essence alive through the obsessive maintenance of every object she had touched. He hired a specialized company to clean and preserve the wedding dress, which was carefully stored in a moisture-proof and light-proof box. The wedding photos were digitized and organized in special albums with acid-free paper, each image protected by special films that would prevent fading over time. The love letters Susan wrote during their courtship were kept in an engraved wooden box he had specially made for this purpose, along with small gifts she had given him throughout the years of their relationship. Every Sunday, he visited the grave where Susan and the baby had been buried together, bringing fresh flowers and talking to them as if they could still hear him through the earth that physically separated them. "My lost loves," he would say, kneeling on the marble tombstone where he had their unforgettable names engraved, "I preserve each moment we lived together as sacred treasures that no time will ever erase from my memory or my heart." Guilt settled in Rick's soul like an emotional parasite that grew and strengthened with each passing day, feeding on every "what if" his tortured mind could create. He obsessively reviewed every decision made during Susan's pregnancy, questioning whether he should have insisted on more preventive exams, whether he should have sought a specialist in high-risk pregnancies, whether he should have taken her to a hospital in another city with more advanced resources. His nights transformed into endless sessions of mental self-flagellation, where each unexplored possibility became a new wound in his conscience already torn apart by loss. He convinced himself that he had failed in the most fundamental role of his life, protecting the people he loved above all else. Dr. Williams had explained that the complications were unpredictable and that no examination could have detected in advance the problems that arose during childbirth. But the medical logic could not penetrate through the wall of guilt that Rick had built around his wounded heart. "I should have been more careful, more attentive to the signs," he repeated every morning upon waking, looking at the mirror that reflected a man he didn't recognize. "I should have questioned the doctors more, should have demanded more precautions, should have protected you better than any father has ever protected his family." As the years passed, Rick channeled his pain into a relentless pursuit of financial success, as if he could compensate through material wealth for the life he failed to preserve. Your company, which was once just a thriving business, transformed into a commercial empire that grew exponentially each year, fueled by the manic energy of a man who worked 20 hours a day to avoid having time to think about his own loneliness. He made generous donations to hospitals, maternity wards, and orphanages, always anonymously, as if he could somehow save other families from the cruel fate that had destroyed his own. Each financial conquest, each new million-dollar contract, each expansion of his business sounded hollow in his ears, echoing in the emotional void that no amount of money could fill. His employees respected and feared him in equal measure, observing how he had transformed into a relentless productivity machine that seemed to never need rest or moments of leisure. "Susan, my eternal companion," he whispered during lonely dawns in his office, surrounded by contracts and spreadsheets representing unimaginable fortunes. "I build this empire in memory of the love you gave me, hoping that somehow my wealth can save other families from the tragedy that separated us forever." 20 years passed like decades of perpetual winter in Rick's soul, transforming the hopeful 25-year-old young man into a 45-year-old man with silver hair at his temples and expression lines marked by chronic sadness. His fortune had grown exponentially, transforming him into one of the richest and most powerful men in the region, but he lived like a hermit in his imposing mansion, surrounded by silent employees who had learned to respect his almost religious need for solitude. The only people with whom he maintained regular contact were those absolutely essential to the operation of his businesses, And even then, his interactions were brief, professional, and devoid of any genuine human warmth. He had become an urban legend among the younger people in the city, the mysterious millionaire who had tragically lost his family and had never again shown interest in romantic relationships or any form of social life. On that stormy October night, exactly 20 years after Susan's death, he drove alone on the deserted road, returning from a business meeting that had ended much later than planned. "2 decades have passed, my beloved Susan," he murmured to the windshield blurred by the torrential rain, "and I still feel your absence like an open wound that never heals. I still hear your sweet voice whispering my name in the night winds that pass through the windows of our empty house." The storm had transformed the secondary road into a raging and dangerous river, with lightning illuminating the dark sky at irregular intervals, creating a terrifying spectacle of light and shadow that perfectly mirrored the turbulent emotional state that Rick had carried in his soul for 2 decades. He drove his luxury car with the redoubled care he had developed over the years, experienced hands firm on the wheel, while the wipers worked frantically against the heavy drops that hammered the glass like lead bullets. The radio played soft instrumental music that he wasn't really listening to, lost as always in his habitual thoughts about Susan and the child he never knew, imagining what life would be like if they were there with him, if the passenger seat were occupied by the woman he loved, and the back seat equipped with a child seat, where a 20-year-old would be returning from some university activity. Suddenly, the powerful headlights of the car cut through the rain curtain and illuminated a small, hunched figure by the roadside, hugging something against her chest with a desperate intensity that immediately awakened all the protective instincts that Rick thought he had buried along with his family. "My God in heaven," he exclaimed out loud, immediately stepping on the brake. "A young woman alone in this hellish storm. I need to help her before something terrible happens to this defenseless creature." It was a young woman who appeared to be about 20 years old, with soaked black hair that stuck to her pale face like seaweed, and clothes so torn and dirty that it was impossible to determine their original color. She held against her chest what appeared to be a small wooden box, treating it as if it were the most precious and fragile object in the entire universe. Even through the torrential rain that distorted his vision, Rick could see that she was trembling violently, not just from the penetrating cold of the storm, but from something much deeper and more primitive, an absolute terror that seemed to be engraved in every fiber of her thin and frail being. Her clothes were in tatters that betrayed not only extreme poverty, but also a long and painful journey through hostile terrain, and her bare feet showed signs of a long walk across difficult ground that formed at the roadside. The sight of that helpless young woman awakened in Rick emotions he thought he had buried forever, along with his capacity to genuinely care for other human beings. "This girl is in mortal danger," he thought, feeling his heart race for the first time in decades. "I cannot simply drive past and leave her to die of cold and exposure in this storm that seems to have come straight from hell." He pulled over on the precarious shoulder and turned on his hazard lights, grabbing a large umbrella from the back seat before bravely facing the fury of the storm that tried to knock him down with every step. The rain was so intense it seemed like a vertical cascade pouring from the enraged heavens, and the wind howled like a wounded creature, pushing Rick from side to side as he struggled to approach the mysterious young woman. When she noticed his approach, she lifted her head with a sudden movement that revealed large, terrified eyes, like those of a wild animal cornered by predators. She instinctively backed away a few steps, clutching the box even tighter against her chest, in a protective gesture that deeply touched Rick's hardened heart. There was something disturbingly familiar in her delicate movements, a natural grace that immediately reminded him of Susan, and how she moved around the house with an unconscious elegance that always enchanted him. "Young lady, please don't be afraid of me," Rick shouted above the roar of the storm, extending the umbrella toward her. "You cannot stay here in this terrible rain. Let me help you find a safe, dry place." The young woman studied him with distrustful eyes that seemed to have seen too many horrors for someone so young, clearly debating internally whether she should trust this well-dressed stranger who had appeared from the night like an apparition. Rick noticed that she carefully examined his expensive suit, his luxury car, and his body posture, trying to determine whether he represented a threat or an opportunity for salvation. The rain continued to fall relentlessly on both of them, completely drenching them as they sized each other up in that moment of hesitation that could define both their fates. She seemed to be furiously debating with herself, weighing the risks of accepting help from a stranger against the certainty of death by exposure if she remained there much longer. The box she was holding was clearly very important to her, treated with an almost religious care that deeply intrigued Rick, making him wonder what precious treasures might be stored in that simple wooden container. "I swear by the memory of the people I loved most in life," said Rick, placing a hand over his heart in a solemn gesture, "that I will not harm you in any way. I just want to get you out of this storm before you die of pneumonia or get struck by lightning." It was in this crucial moment that the impossible happened. A particularly bright and prolonged lightning bolt cut through the night sky like a blade of divine light, illuminating the young woman's face for several perfect seconds that allowed Rick to see with crystal clarity every detail of her delicate features. And there, exactly on the right side of her forehead, in the same position where Susan had an identical mark since childhood, was a small crescent-shaped scar that made the entire world stop spinning around Rick. He felt as if he had taken a devastating punch to the stomach, all the air leaving his lungs at once, while his brain desperately struggled to process that visual impossibility that defied all laws of logic and reality. The umbrella in his trembling hands almost slipped as he leaned heavily against the car, his eyes fixed on that impossible mark that instantly transported him across 2 decades of time and pain, back to that terrible night at the hospital when he lost everything that gave meaning to his existence. "This cannot be happening," whispered Rick, his voice being completely swallowed by the deafening noise of the storm. "Susan, my love lost forever, could you be sending me an impossible sign from beyond through this mysterious young woman who bears the same sacred mark that made you unique in the entire world?" Rick remained motionless for several seconds, the umbrella trembling in his hands, as the rain continued to hammer relentlessly on both of them, creating a liquid curtain that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. The young woman noticed the radical change in his expression, as if he had seen a ghost materialize before his eyes, and instinctively took another step back, pressing the wooden box even more tightly against her chest. Her dark eyes, large and frightened like those of a cornered deer, examined Rick's face with a mixture of terror and confusion, trying to decipher what had caused such an intense reaction in the stranger offering help. The storm seemed to have increased in intensity, as if nature itself was conspiring to create a dramatic setting appropriate for that impossible encounter that defied all laws of probability and destiny. "Why are you looking at me that way?" she asked with a trembling, hoarse voice. "What's wrong with me that makes you look so haunted?" Her voice was soft and melodic, despite the fear that filled it, carrying a timbre that ricocheted through the decades in Rick's memory like a painful echo of whispered conversations on nights of love. It was as if Susan was speaking through the lips of that young beggar, using the same musical inflections that used to lull Rick to sleep during the 2 blessed years of their marriage. He fought against the dizziness that threatened to knock him down, forcing himself to breathe slowly and deeply while trying to regain some control over his shattered emotions. The mark on her forehead glowed palely under the intermittent light of lightning, a scar identical to the one he had kissed 1,000 times on Susan's beloved face, always joking that it was there that an angel had touched his wife to mark her as special. "I'm sorry, You remind me of someone very important whom I lost a long time ago," Rick managed to articulate, extending the umbrella toward her again. "Please accept my help. You'll die if you stay here in this storm, and I couldn't live with myself knowing I let that happen." The young woman studied his face more carefully, noticing the tears that mixed with rain on his mature cheeks, and something in his expression of genuine pain touched a sensitive chord in her heart, hardened by years of rejection and cruelty. She had learned to distrust all adults, especially rich men who appeared offering help during her most vulnerable moments. But there was a different quality in this stranger's voice, a deep sadness that echoed her own experience of loss and abandonment. Her survival instincts, honed by 2 decades of life on the streets and in cruel orphanages, detected sincerity where they would normally find predators disguised as good Samaritans. Still, she kept a safe distance, balancing the weight of a lifetime of disappointments against the urgent need to reach the hospital before it was too late to save the only person who truly mattered in her lonely existence. "I can't trust you," she said, but her voice carried more hesitation than conviction. "Men like you never help people like me without wanting something in return. What do you really want from me?" Rick felt his heart painfully contract upon hearing the desperation and raw distrust in the voice of that young woman who seemed to carry the weight of an entire world of suffering on her fragile shoulders. She couldn't be more than 20 years old, but her eyes reflected a forced maturity that came only from someone who had faced the worst cruelties that human life was capable of inflicting. Her torn and bloodied clothes told stories of violence and neglect that he dared not imagine, and the protective way she held that simple wooden box suggested that its contents literally represented everything she possessed in the world. The rain had transformed her pale skin into something almost translucent, revealing the network of blue veins that ran beneath the surface like a map of human vulnerability, and her lips had acquired a bluish tinge that betrayed the first stages of hypothermia. "My name is Rick, and I swear on the memory of my late wife that I only want to help you," he said, taking off his own coat and offering it to her. "You're freezing to death, and whatever you're carrying in that box won't be worth anything if you die before reaching your destination." The mention of a deceased wife caused something to change subtly in the young woman's expression, as if this information had created an unexpected connection between their respective stories of loss and suffering. She looked at the expensive coat he was offering, clearly trying to decide whether accepting that gesture of kindness would represent a trap or genuine salvation. Rick noticed how she looked alternately at him and the road ahead, as if calculating whether she could outrun him if she needed to escape, and realized that any sudden movement on his part might frighten her and make her disappear into the darkness of the storm. Her bare feet left bloody footprints in the mud, showing that she had walked a considerable distance through hostile terrain, and Rick wondered what kind of desperate emergency could force someone so young to face a storm like that, carrying only a mysterious box. "Please at least take the coat," he insisted, taking a careful step toward her. "Then you can decide whether or not you want to accept a ride. But you need to warm up now, before it's too late for any kind of help." Finally, she extended a trembling hand and accepted the coat, wrapping herself in it with a silent gratitude that deeply touched Rick's heart. The expensive, warm fabric seemed to bring her immediate relief, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the sensation of protection she hadn't experienced in a long time. When she opened them again, Rick saw that some of her defenses had slightly lowered, revealing beneath the distrust an exhausted young woman carrying a burden too heavy for her delicate shoulders. She took a deep breath, seeming to make an important decision, and looked directly into his eyes with an intensity that surprised him by the maturity and determination it showed. The rain continued to fall torrentially around them, but somehow the moment had acquired an almost intimate quality, as if they had entered a bubble of suspended time where only their two souls existed in the universe. "My name is Catherine," she finally said, her voice still cautious but carrying a natural dignity that contrasted dramatically with her worn appearance. "And you're right about one thing. I need to get somewhere urgently, more urgently than you can imagine." Her name hit Rick like another emotional lightning bolt, echoing through his memory, until it reached old conversations where Susan talked about the names she would like to give to the children they planned to have together. Catherine had been the first name on Susan's list for a girl, because she said she wanted her daughter to always carry with her the ability to keep hope alive, even in the darkest moments of life. The coincidence was impossible, devastating in its cruel precision, and Rick had to lean against the car to avoid falling, feeling as if the universe was conspiring to torture him with ghostly echoes of a future that had been brutally torn from him 2 decades before. Catherine noticed his reaction and frowned, clearly confused by the emotional intensity that her simple name had provoked in this gentle stranger who seemed to be fighting invisible demons. "What's wrong with my name?" she asked, taking an involuntary step toward him. "Why does it affect you so much? Did you really know someone named Catherine before?" Rick slowly shook his head, trying to organize thoughts that seemed to have been placed in an emotional blender and mixed until they became unrecognizable. How could he explain to a frightened and desperate young woman that she carried the name that his dead wife had chosen for the daughter who was never born, that her physical appearance echoed traits he had adored in another woman, that her mere existence there on that deserted road seemed to defy all laws of casualty. He breathed deeply, forcing himself to focus on the present and the obvious need he saw before him, pushing the disturbing coincidences to a corner of his mind where he could deal with them later, when there wasn't a human life in immediate danger. Catherine awaited his response with a patience that seemed strange, considering the urgency she had mentioned, as if something in his presence had awakened a curiosity that temporarily overcame her immediate concerns. "My wife had chosen that name for our daughter," Rick said carefully, observing how she would react to this information. "But they died in childbirth 20 years ago, and I never heard that name spoken again until now." The revelation created a moment of heavy silence between them, broken only by the constant roar of the storm that continued to discharge its fury upon the world. Catherine processed this information with a seriousness that seemed disproportionate to her apparent age, her large eyes reflecting an instinctive understanding of the kind of pain Rick carried with him. She had known many forms of loss in her short but brutal life, and recognized in his eyes the same emptiness she saw in her own reflection every morning, the unmistakable mark of someone who had lost the most important people in their existence. For a moment, the distrust she maintained as protective armor dissolved, replaced by a genuine empathy that surprised her with its intensity. The storm seemed to be diminishing slightly, or perhaps they had simply become accustomed to its fury. But either way, the moment gained a more intimate quality that allowed a real human connection between two strangers united by the geography of suffering. "I'm very sorry for your loss," she said, and for the first time her voice carried more compassion than fear. "I understand what it's like to lose the people we love most in the world. That's why I need to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. My daughter Samantha is dying, and I'm the only person in the world who can save her." Her words hit Rick with the force of a high-speed train, instantly reorganizing all his priorities and transforming that casual encounter into a medical emergency that required immediate action. Catherine had a 5-year-old daughter who was fighting for her life in some hospital, and she had faced a brutal storm carrying only a mysterious box, probably walking for miles through dangerous terrain to try to arrive in time to save the child. The absolute maternal dedication this represented touched a deep chord in Rick's heart, reminding him of the fierce love Susan had shown for their unborn baby, and how she would have walked through hell if it could ensure her child's safety. The urgency of the situation swept away all hesitations and disturbing coincidences, replacing them with a clear and immediate purpose that he hadn't felt in 2 decades. "Get in the car right now," he said, opening the passenger door with a decisive gesture. "I'll take you to the hospital immediately. Your daughter can't wait another minute, and by driving we can get there in a fraction of the time it would take walking." Catherine hesitated for only a second before rushing to the car, slipping into the luxurious leather seat with the wooden box still clutched to her chest, as if her life depended on keeping it safe. Rick ran to the driver's side, started the engine and stepped on the accelerator with a determination he hadn't shown in years, the car wheels struggling against the mud on the road before finally finding traction. The heated interior of the vehicle created an atmosphere of forced intimacy where they could finally see each other clearly under the soft light of the dashboard, and Rick took the opportunity to study Catherine's delicate features more carefully as she gradually warmed up. She was extraordinarily beautiful, despite the dirt and destroyed clothes, with features that strongly resembled Susan, but with enough differences that she was clearly a unique and individual person. Her black hair was more wavy than Susan's, and her eyes had a slightly different color, but the delicate bone structure and the graceful way she moved were astonishingly similar to the woman he had lost. "Which hospital?" he asked, carefully navigating through the storm. "And tell me about Samantha. What happened to her?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears when she began to speak about her daughter, revealing a maternal tenderness that contrasted dramatically with the hardness that circumstances had forced her to develop to survive. Samantha was everything to her, the only source of light in a life that had been dominated by darkness and rejection from the moment she was born. The girl had contracted severe pneumonia a week ago, an infection that had spread rapidly through her small and fragile lungs, threatening to slowly suffocate her if she didn't receive immediate and adequate medical treatment. Catherine had taken her daughter to the public hospital, but the doctors had said they needed expensive medications that the free healthcare system could not provide, medications that cost more money than she could earn in years of hard work in the degrading jobs she could find. "She's at Santa Maria Hospital on the other side of the city," said Catherine, her voice breaking with emotion. "The doctors said I have until tomorrow morning to get the money, or they can't do anything more for her. Samantha is everything I have in the world, Mr. Rick. If she dies, I die with her." The raw pain in Catherine's voice echoed through the car like a primal cry that touched every fiber of Rick's being, awakening in him a paternal empathy that had been buried along with his dreams of fatherhood 2 decades ago. He could perfectly imagine what it would be like to be in her position, watching helplessly as a beloved child withered away for lack of medical resources that people like him considered trivial. The cruel injustice of the situation, where a precious life could be lost simply for lack of money, filled him with righteous anger that channeled all his energy toward an immediate resolution of the problem. Santa Maria Hospital was almost an hour away under normal conditions, but Rick knew shortcuts through the city that could cut that time in half, especially driving with the fierce determination that now completely possessed him. "Don't worry about the money," he said with a firm and decisive voice. "I will pay all the medical costs necessary to save Samantha. No child should die for lack of resources when there are people in the world with the capacity to help." Rick's instant generosity left Catherine temporarily speechless, struggling to process the fact that a complete stranger was offering to save her daughter's life without asking for anything in return. Her life experience had taught her that nothing was free, that every kindness came with a hidden price that would eventually be collected in unexpected and often painful ways. She studied his profile as he drove with intense concentration through the storm, trying to detect signs of hidden motivations or predatory intentions, but finding only a genuine determination to help that seemed to spring from somewhere deep in his wounded soul. The tears she had been holding back finally overflowed, running down her cheeks like rivers of relief and gratitude that she hadn't experienced in years. Rick seemed to be exactly the kind of miracle she had prayed for, during all those nights keeping vigil beside Samantha's hospital bed, watching her daughter struggle to breathe through lungs filled with fluid. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't even know us. Why would you risk so much for 2 strangers who can offer you nothing in return?" Rick drove in silence for a few moments, contemplating how to respond to a question that touched on the core of his own journey through loss and meaning. The truth was that he saw in Catherine and Samantha an opportunity for redemption that he had been unconsciously searching for 2 decades, a chance to save the family he had failed to protect when it mattered most. There was something about that desperate young mother that awakened all the protective instincts he thought he had lost along with Susan and his baby, as if the universe was offering him a second chance to be the hero he had failed to be when his own family needed him. But more than that, there were the impossible coincidences. The name Catherine, the identical scar, even the way she moved, that suggested connections that defied rational explanations and touched something mystical in his understanding of fate and purpose. "Because 20 years ago I couldn't save my own family," he finally said, his voice laden with brutal honesty. "And maybe helping you and Samantha is the way the universe found to give me a second chance to do the right thing. Maybe some people come into our lives exactly when we need them most, even if we don't fully understand why." His response touched something deep in Catherine's heart, an instinctive understanding that their lives had become intertwined for reasons that transcended simple coincidence. She had prayed so much and so desperately for a miracle that could save Samantha, that she began to wonder if Rick wasn't exactly the answer she had been begging the heavens for. The sincerity in his voice, the pain she recognized in his eyes, and the instant generosity with which he offered help without questioning, all created a portrait of a man who deeply understood the value of human life because he had experienced its loss in a devastating way. She clutched the wooden box tighter against her chest, feeling the weight of the precious objects she carried inside. Treasures that represented the only connection she had with a mother she never knew, and a past that had been stolen from her before she could even form memories. "I believe in destiny too," she said carefully. And maybe you're right about people entering our lives when we need them most. This box I carry contains the only things that remained from my mother, and I was trying to decide if I should sell them to pay for Samantha's treatment. Her words created a new layer of emotional complexity in the already charged situation, and Rick felt his curiosity awakened about the contents of that box that Catherine treated with such reverence. If she was willing to sell the last memories of her dead mother to save her daughter, that spoke about the depth of her maternal love and the desperation of her situation. He slightly reduced the car's speed when they reached a part of the road where the storm had caused significant flooding, carefully navigating through puddles that could swallow the vehicle if he wasn't careful. The conversation had created an atmosphere of unexpected intimacy between them, two wounded souls who had found mutual comfort in sharing their respective tragedies and hopes. "You don't need to sell anything," said Rick firmly. "I can cover all of Samantha's medical costs and you can keep your mother's memories where they belong, with you. But if you don't mind me asking, how did your mother die? Were you very young when it happened?" Catherine remained quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the contours of the wooden box, as she decided how much of her personal history she was willing to share with this kind stranger who had become her salvation. The truth was complicated and painful, full of gaps and mysteries that she had never managed to completely resolve, despite years of trying to reconstruct the fragments of her past. Her mother had died when she was a baby, in circumstances that were never fully explained by the orphanage staff where she grew up, leaving only some personal possessions and a sealed letter that was to be given to Catherine when she turned 18. The letter had revealed disturbing information about her origin, suggesting there was more to her story than official records indicated, but had also raised questions that seemed impossible to answer. "My mother died shortly after I was born," she said carefully, "in the same hospital where we're going now, actually. She left some things for me, including a letter that I only got to read 2 years ago. The letter, well, it said things I'm still trying to fully understand. The mention that Catherine's mother had died at St. Mary's Hospital created yet another impossible coincidence that made Rick feel as if he was being pulled by invisible threads through a labyrinth of connections that defied all logic. The hospital they were rushing to save Samantha was the same place where Catherine's mother had lost her life 20 years earlier, approximately at the same time he had lost Susan and his baby. His mind began to work feverishly, trying to process the implications of these growing coincidences, while maintaining focus on driving safely through the storm that was finally beginning to decrease in intensity. There was something about the whole situation that seemed to be more than chance, as if greater forces were orchestrating events to bring them together at that specific moment and that specific place. "What kind of things did the letter say?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the growing agitation he felt. "And what kind of objects did your mother leave for you? Perhaps I can help you better understand your story, especially if it's connected to St. Mary's Hospital." Catherine hesitated again, clearly debating internally how much she should reveal to someone she had just met, even if that someone was demonstrating extraordinary generosity. Her mother's letter contained information that could completely change her life if true, but also raised dangerous questions about powerful people who might prefer certain truths remain buried. She had spent 2 years discreetly investigating the clues contained in the letter, but her attempts to discover more about her origin had been blocked at every turn by lost records, staff who refused to speak, and doors that closed in her face whenever she mentioned certain dates and names. Rick's presence, however, and his immediate willingness to help, created an opportunity that might never arise again, the chance to have a powerful ally who could open doors that remained closed to someone of her social position. "The letter said that my father is a rich and powerful man who never knew of my existence," she said slowly, carefully observing his reaction, "and that my mother died trying to find him to tell him about me. She left some things that belonged to her, things that could prove who I really am if I could find the right people." Rick's heart began to beat faster as the pieces of an impossible puzzle started to fit together in his mind, creating a pattern that was simultaneously terrifying and miraculous in its implications. A 20-year-old young woman whose name was Catherine, who had a scar identical to Susan's, whose mother had died in the same hospital where he lost his family at the same time, and who now revealed that her father was a rich man who never knew of her existence. The coincidences were accumulating beyond any reasonable statistical possibility, suggesting connections that his rational brain refused to accept, but that his heart began to suspect with a mixture of terror and hope. He forced himself to keep his voice calm as he asked the question that could change their lives forever, or confirm that he was simply projecting his own desperate desires onto a series of cruel coincidences. "What kind of things did your mother leave for you?" he asked, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly enough to leave his knuckles white. "And would you happen to know her name? Maybe I can help you find the answers you're looking for." Catherine studied him carefully for a moment, noticing the growing intensity in his voice and the way his hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. There was something in his reaction that suggested more than casual curiosity, as if his questions were motivated by something deeper and more personal than a simple desire to help. She made a decision that could change the course of both their lives, moving the wooden box to a position where she could easily open it, her fingers working on the simple latches she had opened and closed 1,000 times over the years whenever she needed to connect with the mother she never knew. The rain had diminished to a soft drizzle that gently sprayed the windshield, and the city lights were beginning to appear in the distance, signaling they were approaching the hospital where Samantha waited for help. "My mother's name was Susan," she said, lifting the lid of the box, "and she left these things for me, a wedding dress, some photos, and a letter addressed to my daughter if I don't survive. Maybe you can help me understand what all this means." The entire world ceased to exist for Rick when he heard the name Susan leave Catherine's lips, and he had to slam on the brakes to avoid completely losing control of the car. His hands trembled violently as he parked on the side of the road, unable to continue driving while processing the impossibility of what he had just heard. Susan, his Susan, had died in childbirth 20 years before, along with the baby they thought they had lost. But now a young woman of exactly the right age was sitting beside him, carrying objects that belonged to his deceased wife, and revealing details about her origin that suggested a truth as impossible as it was miraculous. He turned to look inside the box that Catherine was opening, and when he saw the familiar white fabric of Susan's wedding dress, his tears began to fall like a cascade of recognition and disbelief. "My God," he whispered, extending a trembling hand toward the dress he had seen Susan wear on the happiest day of his life. "This is my wife Susan's wedding dress. She wore this at our wedding 22 years ago." The silence that followed Rick's words was broken only by the soft sound of rain, gradually diminishing against the windshield, as if the storm itself was holding its breath to witness the impossible moment unfolding inside the car. Catherine held the wedding photograph with fingers that seemed unable to stop trembling, her eyes moving frantically between the image of the radiant woman in the white dress and the devastated man sitting beside her, trying to process a reality that completely rewrote everything she believed she knew about her own existence. The resemblance between her and Susan in the photograph was so pronounced that it seemed to have been created by an artist with an obsession for details. Every facial feature echoing across 2 decades, like a genetic echo that could not be denied or explained by coincidence. Rick watched her reaction with a mixture of desperate hope and absolute terror, as if he were looking at a miracle that could disappear if he blinked or breathed too loudly. "If you're really my father," said Catherine, her voice almost a whisper, "then why did the doctors tell you I died? Where were you during all these years of hell I've been through?" The question hit Rick like a bullet to the chest, forcing him to confront the terrifying possibility that he had wasted 2 decades mourning a daughter who was alive and suffering somewhere in the world, desperately needing the paternal love he had buried, along with his shattered hopes. His hands trembled as he took the letter Catherine offered, the envelope yellowed by time but still carefully sealed, as if Susan knew her final words would need to survive decades of separation to reach the daughter she might never know personally. The paper opened with a whisper that seemed to echo through time, revealing Susan's familiar and elegant handwriting, each letter formed with the meticulous care of someone who knew she was writing her last words to the most important person in her life. The first lines of the letter made Rick's world collapse again, but this time in a completely different way, revealing secrets that Susan had carried alone during the last months of her life. "My dear daughter," he began to read aloud. "If you are reading this, it means I've departed before being able to personally tell the secrets I kept to protect both you and your father from a truth I feared could destroy our family before it truly began." The letter revealed that Susan had discovered she was pregnant with twins during her 5th month of pregnancy, news that filled her simultaneously with indescribable joy and paralyzing terror. She had obsessively researched multiple pregnancies, discovering alarming statistics about maternal mortality and complications that could result in the loss of one or both children, information that kept her awake during endless nights while Rick slept innocently beside her. Her delicate physical constitution, which had always been a source of concern for Rick, became an additional risk factor that doctors mentioned in private consultations she secretly scheduled during the hours when Rick was working. The decision to hide the existence of the second baby had been the most difficult of her life, motivated not by lack of trust in Rick, but by excessive love for him and fear that the additional anxiety might impair his ability to support her during those crucial months. "I knew your father well enough to know he would blame himself for any complication," the letter continued, "and I couldn't bear the thought of seeing the man I love torture himself over circumstances completely beyond his control." The desperate plan Susan had devised was at once noble in its intentions and tragic in its unintended consequences. She had convinced Dr. Williams to omit information about the second pregnancy from the official records Rick had access to, arguing that she wanted to reveal the surprise herself at the right time, but secretly preparing for the possibility that something could go wrong during childbirth. Through careful conversations with trusted nurses, she had found a professional with 20 years of experience who agreed to help her execute a contingency plan if the worst-case scenario materialized. If Susan did not survive childbirth, she should discreetly find a loving family to adopt the second baby, allowing at least one of the children to have the chance to grow up in a stable home without carrying the emotional burden of having cost her mother's life. The logic behind the decision was that Rick could mourn and eventually recover from the loss of a wife and one baby, but would be destroyed by guilt if he knew that 2 lives had been lost because of his decision to start a family. "I was trying to save at least part of our family," Susan explained in her letter, "but now I realize that I may have made a decision that neither of you will ever forgive me for." The night of the delivery had unfolded exactly as Susan feared, with complications that quickly transformed what should have been a celebration into a medical tragedy. The first baby was born first, but was already dead due to umbilical cord complications that could not be detected in advance. A devastating blow that almost made Susan give up before even trying to bring the second child into the world. Catherine was born 20 minutes later, small but vigorous, filling the room with cries that were simultaneously heavenly music and funeral lament in her dying mother's ears. The complications after childbirth became critical, and Susan realized her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Her last conscious moments were spent whispering desperate instructions to the nurse, begging her to execute the plan they had discussed, but with a crucial modification: to tell Rick that both babies had died, to spare him the agony of knowing that a daughter was alive somewhere in the world, growing up without knowing her true father. "She believed she was protecting me from pain," Rick understood, his voice breaking. "But in reality, she condemned me to 20 years of a different hell, while you suffered alone in the world." The execution of Susan's plan by the nurse had been perverted in ways the dying mother could never have anticipated. Instead of finding a loving family for Catherine as promised, she had sold the baby to an orphanage that functioned more as a profitable business than a childcare institution, receiving a substantial payment for a healthy child who represented years of government subsidies for the institution. St. Vincent's Orphanage was known by system workers as a place where children were stored rather than raised, where basic needs were met with minimal efficiency, while emotional needs were completely ignored by overworked and underpaid staff. Catherine had spent the first 10 years of her life in that cold and impersonal environment, where the small scar on her forehead became a constant source of cruel ridicule from other children and staff who called her marked and defective. "I grew up believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me," revealed Catherine, unconsciously touching the scar, "that my own mother had abandoned me because I was too ugly or troubled to be loved by any normal person. Catherine's placement attempts with adoptive families throughout her childhood and adolescence had been a series of nightmares that confirmed her worst fears about her own fundamental inadequacy. The first family, when she was 10, initially seemed promising. A middle-aged couple who claimed to want to give a chance to an older child whom others had rejected. However, it quickly became clear that they saw Catherine more as free domestic help than as a daughter, forcing her to cook, clean, and care for their younger biological children while denying her proper education or basic demonstrations of affection. When she tried to rebel against the unfair treatment, developing behavioral problems that were actually desperate cries for genuine attention and care, they returned her to the orphanage with complaints that she was ungrateful and incorrigible. This pattern repeated 3 more times during her adolescence, each rejection deepening her conviction that she was destined to be abandoned by anyone who had the misfortune of knowing her intimately. "Each family that returned me confirmed what I already knew," she said, tears flowing freely down her cheeks, "that there is something in me that makes people inevitably abandon me. The scar is just the visible symbol of all the internal defects I carry." At 16, when she aged out of the adoption system, Catherine was forced to face the adult world completely unprepared and without any support network or practical skills beyond those she had learned through years of neglect and abuse. She found work at a small, dirty restaurant where the owner paid below minimum wages to employees without proper documentation, sleeping in a tiny room above the establishment that she shared with 3 other equally desperate young women. It was there that she met a waiter, only 2 years older, who had also grown up in the orphanage system, and who instinctively understood the emotional wounds she carried without needing long explanations or elaborate justifications. He was the first person in her life who looked at her scar and said it was beautiful, that it made her look like a fairy tale princess who had survived a dangerous adventure and emerged stronger and wiser. "He made me feel for the first time that perhaps I wasn't completely inadequate," she recalled with a sad smile. "He said my scar looked like a crescent moon that marked me as someone special, chosen by nature itself for extraordinary things." The relationship with him had lasted 4 precious years, during which Catherine experienced for the first time in her life what it meant to be unconditionally loved by someone who knew her completely, including all her insecurities and traumas, but who chose to stay by her side regardless. They lived together in precarious but hope-filled conditions, working degrading jobs during the day and dreaming together at night about a future where they could have their own home, a real family, and the emotional stability that both had been denied during their traumatic childhoods. When Catherine discovered she was pregnant with Samantha, both she and he were initially terrified by the overwhelming responsibility of raising a child when they themselves were still trying to figure out how to be functional adults. However, fear quickly transformed into fierce determination to break the cycle of abandonment and neglect that had defined their own lives, promising each other that their baby would grow up, knowing unconditional love and emotional security from the first day of life. "We swore that our daughter would never feel rejected or inadequate," said Catherine, her voice laden with renewed pain. "That she would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved more than anything in the world." His death in a construction accident, when Samantha was only 2 years old, had completely destroyed the carefully constructed world that Catherine had finally managed to create for herself. He was working on a dangerous construction site without adequate safety equipment when a serious accident at the work site resulted in the loss of him and 2 equally vulnerable colleagues, disposable in the eyes of greedy employers. The construction company had denied responsibility, blaming human error and offering financial compensation so insignificant that it barely covered the funeral costs, leaving Catherine completely alone with a small child and no realistic prospect of financial or emotional stability. In the 3 years that followed, she had worked multiple jobs simultaneously, cleaning offices during the early morning hours, washing dishes in restaurants during the day, and caring for other people's children during the evenings, all while trying to be a present and loving mother to Samantha, despite the exhaustion that constantly threatened to break her determination. "I would do anything for Samantha," she declared in a firm voice. "She is the only person in the world who loves me for who I am, and I would die before letting her feel the abandonment that defined my own life." Rick listened to every word of Catherine's devastating story, with a mixture of horror, overwhelming guilt, and admiration for the extraordinary strength she had demonstrated by surviving circumstances that would have destroyed much older and more experienced people. Each detail she shared about her life of deprivation and systematic rejections was like a stab in his paternal heart, cruelly reminding him that while he had spent 20 years mourning a dead daughter, his real daughter had been alive and suffering, desperately needing the love and protection he would have gladly given, had he known of her existence. The bitter irony of the situation, where both father and daughter had lived decades of unnecessary pain because of a well-intentioned plan that had been corrupted by human greed, seemed to be the kind of cosmic cruelty that defied any attempt to find meaning or justice in the universe. He reached out to touch Catherine's face, his calloused palms trembling as they caressed the scar that had been a source of so much humiliation for her, but which now represented the undeniable physical proof that she was truly his daughter. "Catherine, my dear lost child," he said, his voice broken by 2 decades of repressed paternal love. "I'm so sorry for every moment of pain you had to endure alone. If I'd known you existed, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you and bring you home where you belong." The embrace that followed was charged with 20 years of unexpressed love, unshed tears, and family connections that had been brutally severed before they even had a chance to properly form. Catherine allowed herself for the first time in her life to experience what it meant to be held by someone who loved her unconditionally, simply for who she was, without expectations or conditions that needed to be met to maintain that love. Rick held his daughter as if she might disappear again if he let her go, feeling through the physical embrace all the fragility and strength she had developed during years of independent survival. The discovery that he had a living daughter was simultaneously the most extraordinary miracle and the most devastating tragedy of his life, because it represented both the answer to his deepest prayers and the confirmation that he had lost 20 precious years that could never be recovered or replaced. However, the urgent reality of the situation with Samantha quickly brought both back to the present, reminding them that there was a small child fighting for her life in a nearby hospital, a granddaughter that Rick had not yet met, but already loved through his love for Catherine. "We need to get to the hospital now," he said, wiping the tears from both their faces. "Samantha needs us, and I'm not going to lose any more members of my rediscovered family." The final race through the city streets passed in a blur of lights and distant sirens, Rick using all his connections and influence to ensure that Samantha would receive the best medical treatment available as soon as they reached the hospital. Catherine clung to the new reality of having finally found her father, but was also terrified by the possibility that Samantha might die on the same night her family had been miraculously reunited after 2 decades of separation. The cruel irony of gaining a father and potentially losing a daughter at the same moment escaped neither of them, and both silently prayed that the universe would not be so cruel as to simultaneously give and take away the most precious things in their lives. When they finally arrived at Santa Maria Hospital, Rick stopped the car at the emergency entrance with the fierce determination of someone who had wasted 20 years being passive in the face of tragedy, and who was determined to actively fight against any force that threatened his newly discovered family. "Whatever Samantha's problem is, we'll face it together," he said, firmly holding Catherine's hand. "You'll never have to face anything alone again, because now we're a real family." They rushed through the hospital's automatic doors, quickly passing through reception, where Rick used his reputation and connections to avoid the normal bureaucracy that could delay Catherine's access to her daughter. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a professionally distant expression, consulted her records with an efficiency that seemed agonizingly slow considering the emotional urgency they both felt. When she finally located information about Samantha, her expression subtly changed, acquiring the kind of gravity that medical professionals develop when they need to convey news that will completely devastate the families anxiously waiting for information about their loved ones. Catherine squeezed Rick's hand hard enough to leave marks, instinctively preparing herself for yet another tragedy in a life that had been defined by successive losses and destroyed hopes. Samantha was transferred to the pediatric intensive care unit 2 hours ago," the receptionist informed, with the professional coldness that hospital staff use to emotionally protect themselves from daily tragedies. "Her condition has deteriorated drastically, and the doctors in charge estimate that she has only a few hours of life remaining if we cannot stabilize her immediately." The news about Samantha's deteriorated condition hit Catherine like a physical blow that made her stagger against the reception counter, her knees weakening as she tried to process that her daughter was dying while she had been discovering the existence of a father she thought lost forever. Rick reacted immediately, putting his arm around Catherine's trembling shoulders while addressing the receptionist with the natural authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. His wallet emerged from inside his jacket like a secret weapon, revealing cards that shone under the hospital's fluorescent light, platinum donor cards, board identification, and documents proving his position as one of the largest financial benefactors of that medical institution. The transformation in the receptionist's attitude was instantaneous and almost comical, her professional coldness melting like ice under scorching sun when she realized she was dealing with someone whose donations paid a significant portion of her own salary. "I want to speak to the medical director immediately," Rick declared in a voice that admitted no argument, "and provide unrestricted access for me and the child's mother. I don't care what protocols need to be broken or what exceptions have to be made." The race through the hospital corridors turned into a surreal demonstration of the power that money and influence exerted over supposedly egalitarian systems, with staff emerging from rooms and offices to greet Rick with exaggerated deference, while looking at Catherine with a mixture of curiosity and barely disguised disdain. Her torn clothes and neglected appearance contrasted drastically with Rick's impeccable suit, creating a visual dichotomy that confused observers trying to understand why a respected millionaire was accompanied by someone who clearly belonged to the lowest layers of society. Catherine felt each look like a stab, each disguised whisper as a confirmation of her fundamental inadequacy to be in that first-class medical environment where people like her normally only entered as charity patients or cleaning staff. With each step toward the pediatric intensive care unit, her anxiety grew exponentially, fueled both by the fear of losing Samantha and the growing certainty that her presence in that place was violating unwritten rules about who deserved access to the best available medical care. "Maybe I shouldn't be here," she murmured to Rick. "People like me don't belong in places like this. What if my presence brings bad luck to Samantha?" The elevator that took them to the 5th floor was a claustrophobic compartment where tension accumulated like atmospheric pressure before a storm, each passing floor intensifying the urgency that both felt but neither dared to fully express in words. Rick observed Catherine progressively shrinking into herself, her body posture revealing decades of social conditioning that taught her to make herself small and invisible in environments where she wasn't welcome, and he felt a growing anger against a system that allowed people to be treated as second-class citizens, based purely on appearance and socioeconomic status. When the doors finally opened, revealing the immaculately clean corridors of the pediatric wing, where the smell of disinfectant mixed with the soft aroma of infant products and where sophisticated machines emitted constant beeps monitoring small and fragile lives, Catherine hesitated at the entrance as if she was about to profane a sacred temple. The passing nurses cast looks of obvious disapproval in her direction, their professional expressions not completely masking the prejudice they felt, seeing someone visibly poor invading a space normally reserved for families who could pay for the best available medical care. "Don't mind them," Rick said firmly. "You have more right to be here than anyone else. Samantha is your daughter and nobody can deny your right to be by her side." The entrance to the intensive care unit was blocked by a robust middle-aged nurse, whose years of hospital experience had given her a natural authority that she exercised like a fierce guardian protecting sacred territory. Her eyes moved critically over Catherine's disheveled appearance, mentally cataloging each tear in her clothes, each dirt stain on her skin, and especially the scar on her forehead that seemed to confirm some kind of predetermined judgment about her character or origin. The woman crossed her arms over her impeccable white uniform and assumed a posture that suggested she had faced many invasion attempts by inadequate people during her career, and that she had developed effective methods to keep undesirables away from vulnerable patients. When Catherine tried to explain that Samantha was her daughter and that she needed to see her immediately, the nurse interrupted with an abrupt hand gesture and an expression of disdain that made no attempt to hide her opinion about lower-class people trying to access premium medical care. "Beggars are not allowed in the intensive care unit," she declared in a voice loud enough to draw attention from other staff. "This is a sterile area for critically ill patients, not a public shelter where any person from the street can enter and contaminate our controlled environment." The public humiliation that followed was like watching a social execution in slow motion, where Catherine was systematically stripped of any human dignity before doctors, nurses, other patients' family members, and administrative staff who gathered like spectators of a cruel spectacle. Whispered comments about that kind of people and how some people don't know their place circulated through the environment like a social virus, infecting the space with a toxicity that transformed a place of healing into an arena of prejudice and class judgment. Catherine felt each word like physical whiplashes, her posture progressively curving as if she was trying to completely disappear, and tears of shame began to run down her cheeks as she fought against the instinct to run from that place that rejected her so completely. Rick observed his daughter's emotional destruction with a growing fury that threatened to explode into physical violence against anyone who continued to treat her as less than human. But he knew that an outburst of anger would only confirm the prejudices that were already being so clearly displayed. "You are speaking to a patient's mother," he said in a controlled voice but loaded with implicit threat, "and I suggest you treat her with the respect that any mother deserves, regardless of her external appearance or financial situation." Rick's intervention created momentary confusion among the staff who were trying to reconcile his known authority with his seemingly inexplicable defense of someone they had automatically categorized as undesirable. The head nurse faltered for a moment, clearly confused about how to proceed, when her unwritten rules about social exclusion collided with the reality that one of the hospital's biggest donors was demanding equal treatment for someone she had instinctively rejected. However, before any resolution could be reached, an authoritative voice cut through the tension like a sharp blade, belonging to an imposing-looking man wearing a white coat with gold embroidery that indicated his elevated position in the medical hierarchy. Dr. Thompson was an intimidating figure, even under normal circumstances, standing over 6.5 feet tall, with grey hair impeccably combed back, and a presence that commanded immediate respect from subordinates and colleagues alike. His dark eyes examined the scene with the analytical coolness of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions, but when his gaze fell upon Catherine, his expression revealed the same prejudice that had infected other staff members. "Mr. Rick," he said in a voice that carried unquestionable authority, "I imagine there is a reasonable explanation for this unusual situation that is disturbing the peace of my medical ward." The confrontation that followed between Rick and Dr. Thompson was a battle of social titans, where financial power collided with medical authority in a spectacle that transformed the hospital corridor into an arena for fundamental questions about human dignity and equal treatment. Dr. Thompson had built his career on a reputation for medical excellence, combined with undisguised social elitism, treating wealthy patients as valuable clients while relegating charity cases to younger residents and less sophisticated equipment. His position as head of pediatrics gave him almost absolute authority over who had access to the best medical care, and he exercised that power with the arrogance of someone who had never been truly challenged for his discriminatory decisions. When Rick explained that Catherine was Samantha's mother and that he would personally guarantee all treatment costs, Dr. Thompson responded with a condescending smile that didn't reach his eyes, clearly amused by the absurd situation of a respected millionaire defending someone he considered social trash. "I'm sure there are mitigating circumstances," he said in a voice dripping with sarcasm, "but I must question why a man of your standing would choose to publicly associate with this type of element. Surely there are more appropriate charitable institutions to exercise your philanthropy without compromising your own reputation." The implicit suggestion that Rick was compromising his own social position by defending Catherine was the spark that ignited an explosion of anger that had been building since the moment he witnessed the first look of disdain directed at his newly discovered daughter. His voice rose several octaves as he confronted Dr. Thompson with an intensity that made nearby staff instinctively back away, creating a circle of space around the two men as if they were about to engage in physical combat. Rick detailed his relationship with Catherine in terms that made it clear that any disrespect directed at her would be considered a personal attack against him, and that his financial influence in the hospital included enough power to end the careers of anyone who continued to treat her as a second-class citizen. The transformation in Dr. Thompson's attitude was gradual but noticeable, his initial arrogance giving way to growing concern about the professional implications of having offended someone with enough power to influence his own position in the hospital hierarchy. However, instead of offering genuine apologies or real behavior change, he doubled down on his elitism, publicly questioning Rick's judgment and suggesting that association with people of that caliber might indicate mental deterioration requiring medical intervention. "Perhaps the stress of your business is affecting your judgment," Dr. Thompson said with calculated malice, "because surely a man of your intelligence would recognize that people like this young woman belong in public clinics, not in first-class medical facilities like ours." The devastating impact of these words on Catherine was visible and immediate, like watching someone being physically beaten in public while spectators remained silent or even showed approval of the violence. She began to back toward the elevator, her hands trembling as she partially covered her face in a futile attempt to hide the tears that flowed freely down her cheeks, each step backward representing a deeper withdrawal into herself, where she had learned to hide when the outside world became too hostile to bear. The campaign of systematic humiliation was working exactly as Dr. Thompson had planned, forcing her to accept that her presence in that environment was intrinsically inappropriate, and that her attempt to access premium medical care for Samantha was presumption that deserved social punishment. Other patients' family members observed the spectacle with expressions ranging from embarrassed discomfort to open approval of the social exclusion being executed before them, some whispering comments about how certain people should learn to accept their places in the social hierarchy without trying to climb beyond their origins. "I shouldn't be here," Catherine muttered, more to herself than to any specific person. "My presence is contaminating this place. Perhaps Samantha has better chances if I simply disappear." Catherine's escape attempt was intercepted by Rick, who reached her just as she was about to press the elevator button, his large, warm hands enveloping her trembling shoulders in a protective gesture that communicated more than words could express about his determination not to allow her to be expelled by prejudice and institutional cruelty. He gently turned her to face him, forcing her to look into his eyes as he tried to convey through eye contact all the validation and support she needed to resist the campaign of dehumanization being waged against her. His voice was soft but loaded with absolute conviction when he spoke, each word carefully chosen to counterbalance the venom that had been poured into her self-esteem by people who should have been offering compassion instead of judgment. The contrast between the casual cruelty of the medical staff and Rick's paternal tenderness created an emotional dichotomy that left Catherine torn between the impulse to flee from further humiliation and the desperate desire to remain close to the only person who seemed to see her as a human being worthy of respect and love. "You belong here more than any of these people," he said with fierce intensity. "Samantha needs her mother by her side, and I need my daughter with me. We won't let ignorance and prejudice separate us again after finally finding each other." Rick's public declaration about his relationship with Catherine created shockwaves that spread through the hospital like an emotional earthquake, forcing staff and observers to completely recalibrate their perceptions of the situation they had been judging based purely on superficial appearances. The revelation that the despised beggar was actually the respected millionaire's daughter instantly transformed the power dynamic in the hallway, converting spectators from moral superiors into embarrassed participants in a family drama that transcended their simplistic social categories. Dr. Thompson, in particular, seemed to undergo a visible physical transformation, his erect posture wilting slightly when he realized he had inadvertently insulted not just an indigent patient, but a member of the family of one of the hospital's most important donors. However, instead of offering genuine apologies or acknowledging the fundamental error of his prejudiced judgments, he doubled down on his arrogance with a different tactic, questioning Rick's mental soundness and suggesting he was being manipulated by a skilled con artist who had detected his emotional vulnerability. "With all due respect, Mr. Rick," he said in an oily voice that carried no respect at all, "men in your position often become targets of unscrupulous people who exploit emotions for financial gain. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that your emotions are being manipulated by someone with less noble motivations than it appears." The suggestion that Catherine was a scammer trying to exploit Rick financially was so absurd considering the circumstances of their meeting that even staff members who had shown prejudice against her began to look at Dr. Thompson with growing discomfort, realizing that he had crossed a line between social discrimination and direct personal attack against a respected hospital benefactor. Catherine herself reacted to the accusation with a mixture of disbelief and renewed pain, realizing that even when her family connection to Rick was established, she was still viewed as a predator trying to take advantage of a well-intentioned but naive man. Her first reaction was to offer to leave immediately, promising never to disturb Rick or question Samantha's medical treatment again, but her voice was drowned out by Rick's explosive response, who finally completely lost control over his accumulated anger. His voice echoed through the corridors like thunder, carrying decades of frustration about social injustices he had passively observed until that moment when they became direct attacks against his own family. "Dr. Thompson," he roared, "you have just accused my daughter of being a criminal, and I guarantee there are severe consequences for this kind of slander against members of my family. I suggest you reconsider your attitude immediately, or you will discover that my influence in this hospital extends far beyond financial donations." The implicit threat in Rick's words was clear to everyone present, especially Dr. Thompson, who suddenly seemed to realize that he had pushed a powerful man beyond his limits of tolerance and that he might be facing serious professional consequences for his arrogance and prejudice. The atmosphere in the corridor changed perceptibly, with staff who had been observing the spectacle as entertainment now recognizing that they were witnessing a confrontation that could result in significant administrative changes at the hospital. Dr. Thompson tried to retreat from his previous position without admitting complete error, offering carefully crafted apologies that acknowledged misunderstandings without accepting personal responsibility for discriminatory judgments he had made publicly. However, the damage had already been done, both to his professional reputation and to Catherine's self-esteem, who now felt responsible for creating conflict between her newly discovered father and the medical authorities responsible for Samantha's care. The emotional complexity of the situation, where her joy in finding family was corrupted by shame about problems her presence was causing, created a psychological whirlwind that threatened to overwhelm her capacity to deal with additional stress. "Perhaps I should wait outside," she suggested quietly. "I don't want my presence to cause more problems for Samantha or for you. Some battles are too big to win." The temporary resolution of the conflict came through the intervention of a younger nurse, who had been observing the entire confrontation with growing discomfort about the behavior of her colleagues and superiors, and who finally found the courage to offer a practical solution that would allow Catherine access to her daughter without further public humiliation. She approached Rick and Catherine with an apologetic expression, explaining that clean uniforms were available that would allow Catherine to dress appropriately for the intensive care environment, and that she would personally escort both of them to Samantha's room once basic hygiene protocols were followed. The offer was gratefully accepted by both, creating an opportunity for Dr. Thompson to retreat from his untenable position without completely losing face, although it was clear to everyone present that his behavior had been inappropriate and potentially damaging to his future position at the hospital. Catherine followed the nurse to a bathroom where she could wash her face and change clothes, transforming from rejected beggar to presentable mother in a matter of minutes, a metamorphosis that cruelly demonstrated how social judgments are based on superficial appearances rather than true character. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said to Rick when she emerged dressed in a simple but clean hospital uniform. "No one has ever fought for me like that before. You really made me feel like I'm worth something." The finally authorized entry into the pediatric intensive care unit revealed a world of advanced medical technology where sophisticated machines constantly monitored vital signs of small children whose lives depended on precise scientific interventions and 24-hour medical care. The environment was simultaneously comforting and terrifying, with soft lights and childish decorations trying to mask the reality that each room contained a child fighting against conditions that could easily result in death if not treated with absolute competence and adequate medical resources. Catherine followed Rick through the corridors with hesitant steps, her anxiety growing exponentially with each meter that brought them closer to the room where Samantha was being kept alive by machines and medications that cost more per day than she could earn in months of hard work. The irony of finally having financial resources available to save her daughter, but possibly too late to make a difference, escaped neither of them as they approached the door that could contain both hope and tragedy. "Be strong," murmured Rick. "Samantha needs to feel our strength, not our fear. Children perceive emotional energy even when they're unconscious." The moment of seeing Samantha for the first time connected to life support equipment was devastating for both adults, but for completely different reasons that reflected their respective relationships with the small child, fighting for her life in a bed that seemed to swallow her fragile body. For Catherine, seeing her daughter surrounded by machines that breathed for her and monitored every heartbeat was visual confirmation of how close she had come to losing the only person in the world who loved her unconditionally. And her first reaction was overwhelming guilt for not having been able to protect Samantha from the circumstances that led to this desperate situation. For Rick, however, seeing his granddaughter for the first time represented the simultaneous discovery of instant love and terror that he might lose her before even having the opportunity to properly know her, a cruel repetition of the pattern that had defined his life through the loss of Susan, and the baby he thought had died decades earlier. Samantha seemed to have inherited physical traits from both Catherine and Susan, creating a genetic continuity that connected 3 generations of women who had faced medical tragedies in the same hospital where they now fought against time to save the youngest of the family. "She's beautiful," whispered Rick, gently touching Samantha's small hand, "and she will survive. Our family won't be separated again by inadequate medicine or lack of resources." The medical consultation that followed revealed that Samantha's condition was more serious than they had initially been informed, with complications that had emerged during the last few hours creating additional urgency for interventions that would require not only substantial financial resources, but also difficult decisions about experimental treatments that could save her life or accelerate her death depending on how her body reacted. Dr. Thompson, clearly trying to repair his reputation after the previous public confrontation, presented treatment options with exaggerated professionalism that attempted to mask his anxiety about the career implications of having offended an important hospital donor. His recommendations included immediate transfer to a specialized hospital in another state, where more advanced equipment and specialists with specific experience in similar cases could offer marginally better chances of complete recovery. However, such a transfer would involve enormous additional costs and significant risks associated with transporting a critically ill patient, creating a dilemma where each option carried possibilities of both salvation and irreversible loss. "Time is the critical factor here," explained Dr. Thompson. "Each passing hour reduces her chances of complete recovery. We need to make decisions immediately." The pressure of making life or death decisions about Samantha, combined with the emotional stress of recent events, began to affect Catherine in ways that threatened her ability to function as an effective advocate for her daughter during the most critical moment of their lives. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to process complex medical information that was presented in technical language that she did not fully understand, and her self-confidence, already damaged by years of social humiliation, was further eroded by the realization that she was making decisions about technologies and procedures that were completely outside her experience or comprehension. Rick noticed her struggle and gently took responsibility for communication with the medical team, translating technical jargon into understandable terms and ensuring that Catherine's maternal perspective was considered in all discussions about treatment, even when she felt too intimidated to speak directly. The dynamics between them was rapidly evolving from strangers who discovered a family connection to a functional parental team working together to protect a child they both loved, albeit for different reasons and with different levels of knowledge about her personality and needs. "We will decide together," Rick assured. "You know Samantha better than anyone, and I have resources to implement whatever decision we make. We're a team now." It was during this moment of collaborative planning that Dr. Thompson emerged from Samantha's room with an expression that immediately alerted both adults to a significant development in the child's medical condition, his face carrying the kind of gravity that medical professionals develop when they need to convey information that will fundamentally alter family expectations about prognosis and treatment options. He approached Rick with exaggerated deference that dramatically contrasted with the arrogance he had previously demonstrated, clearly motivated both by genuine concern about Samantha and by anxiety about repairing the professional relationship he had damaged through prejudice and poor judgment. His body language suggested that the information he carried was serious enough to require a private conversation away from Catherine, implying that there were developments in Samantha's condition that might be too traumatic for her mother to process without adequate preparation. "Mr. Rick," he said in a low voice that carried poorly disguised urgency, "I need to speak with you about the girl in private. There is something you need to know before it's too late to take appropriate actions." The hospital's private room where Dr. Thompson conducted Rick was a sterile and impersonal space, with white walls that seemed to absorb any trace of human warmth and medical furniture that suggested discussions about life and death happened there daily. Two synthetic leather chairs flanked a small table where medical records and imaging exams awaited review, creating a setting that transformed each conversation into a formal consultation between a professional and a family in crisis. Rick sat rigidly on the edge of his chair, his eyes fixed on Dr. Thompson's tense face while trying to mentally prepare himself for information that could completely alter his expectations about Samantha's future and the family he had just rediscovered. The doctor's somber expression suggested that the news was more serious than simply pneumonia complications, and Rick felt a familiar chill run down his spine. The same terrible premonition he had experienced 20 years earlier when awaiting news about Susan and the baby he thought he had lost. "Doctor, please tell me directly what's happening with Samantha," he said. "I've already lost too much time in my life not knowing the truth about people I love." Dr. Thompson opened Samantha's medical chart with deliberately slow movements, revealing pages of notes, test results, and medical images that told a much more complex clinical story than the simple pneumonia that had initially been diagnosed. His hands, normally steady during delicate medical procedures, trembled slightly as he organized documents that confirmed suspicions he had developed during more detailed examinations conducted in the last few hours. The discovery he was about to share was simultaneously an explanation for Samantha's sudden deterioration and a harbinger of medical challenges that would require impossible decisions from a family that had barely reunited. The similarities between Samantha's case and historical medical records he had reviewed during his research created a pattern that was statistically unlikely but medically undeniable, suggesting a genetic predisposition for conditions that had devastated Rick's family decades before. "Mr. Rick," he began, carefully choosing his words, "the tests revealed that Samantha is not just suffering from pneumonia. She inherited an extremely rare congenital heart condition, the same syndrome that caused your wife Susan's death during childbirth." The diagnosis hit Rick like a physical bullet, causing him to double over as he processed the implications of Samantha facing the same medical condition that had killed Susan and supposedly the baby he thought he had lost 2 decades earlier. The cruel irony of finally finding a surviving family only to discover that she carried defective genes that could destroy her in the same way they had destroyed Susan was almost unbearable to process emotionally. Dr. Thompson continued explaining technical details about modified Brugada syndrome, a rare genetic variation that affected heart rhythm and frequently remained dormant until triggered by severe physical stress, such as the lung infection Samantha had contracted. The condition explained why her pneumonia had deteriorated so rapidly and why conventional treatments had failed to stabilize her condition, but also revealed that complete recovery would require medical interventions far more complex and risky than simple antibiotics. Cardiac surgery is necessary to correct structural defects, explained Dr. Thompson, but the procedure is experimental, extremely expensive, and carries significant risks even in healthy adult patients. In a malnourished child like Samantha, the chances of survival are uncertain. The revelation that Samantha would need experimental surgery was followed by even more devastating information. Due to damage that the cardiac condition had caused to her immune system, she would also need a bone marrow transplant from a close relative to rebuild natural defenses against infections that could kill her even if the cardiac surgery was successful. Dr. Thompson explained that compatibility for bone marrow transplantation was determined by specific genetic factors that limited potential donors to direct family members, and that even among relatives, chances of compatibility were only 50%. Rick immediately offered to undergo compatibility testing, but preliminary blood tests had already revealed that he was not a viable candidate due to differences in genetic markers that made his marrow incompatible with Samantha's immune system. The only real hope was Catherine, whose genetic compatibility as the biological mother offered better chances of success, but who also presented unique risks due to years of malnutrition and physical stress that had compromised her own health. Catherine can save Samantha, Dr. Thompson said carefully, but the donation procedure is dangerous for someone in her current physical condition. She is running a significant risk by undergoing the surgery. The conversation that followed explored brutal medical realities about risks associated with bone marrow donation in a malnourished person, including the possibility of organ failure, systemic infection, or death during a procedure that would normally be relatively safe for a healthy donor. Dr. Thompson detailed how years of extreme poverty and inadequate nutrition had created nutritional deficiencies in Catherine that affected her ability to recover from surgical trauma, turning a procedure that would save Samantha into a Russian roulette that could kill her mother in the process. The irony of the situation was devastating. The only person who could save Samantha was also the person least able to survive the necessary procedure, creating a dilemma where saving the child could result in her complete orphanhood if the donation proved fatal to Catherine. Rick fought against waves of despair while contemplating the possibility of losing both daughter and granddaughter in an attempt to save one of them, repeating the cruel pattern that had defined his life through medical losses that defied human intervention. "Are there alternatives?" he asked desperately. "Treatments that don't require Catherine to risk her life. I would give any amount of money, anything I owned, to avoid having to choose between them." Dr. Thompson shook his head gravely, explaining that modern medicine had exhausted less invasive options and that bone marrow transplantation remained the only realistic hope for Samantha's complete recovery. He detailed the critical timeline where each day of delay reduced the chances of success, creating temporal pressure that eliminated the possibility of seeking second opinions or alternative treatments at other medical institutions. The decision needed to be made immediately, before further deterioration made Samantha too weak to survive the surgery, or before Catherine's condition degraded to the point where she could not be a viable candidate for donation. Rick asked about options for strengthening Catherine before the surgery, through intensive nutrition or blood transfusions, but Dr. Thompson explained that significant improvements in her physical condition would require weeks or months that Samantha did not have available. The only possibility was to proceed with surgery immediately, accepting the elevated risks for both in the hope that maternal love and Catherine's determination would be enough to overcome the physical deficiencies that made the procedure dangerous. "I need to explain the situation to Catherine," Rick finally said. "She has the right to know all the risks before making a decision that could cost her own life. But I already know what her choice will be. She would do anything to save Samantha." The return to the room where Catherine anxiously waited was the most difficult walk Rick had taken since the hospital corridors 20 years earlier when he lost Susan. Each step weighted with information that would force impossible decisions on people he loved more than life itself. Catherine rose immediately when she saw him approach, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hope or despair that might indicate Samantha's fate even before words were spoken. The grave expression he carried immediately communicated the seriousness of the situation, and she instinctively braced herself for yet another tragedy in a life defined by successive losses and shattered hopes. Rick sat beside her and gently took her hands, feeling through the physical touch how she trembled with anxiety and emotional exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her capacity to process additional information about Samantha's medical crisis. His words were carefully chosen to convey the complete truth about Samantha's condition, without completely destroying the hope that kept Catherine functioning during the most critical moment of their lives. "Samantha can be saved," he said softly, "but the treatment she needs is dangerous and will require extraordinary courage on your part. You are the only person in the world who can give her what she needs to survive." The explanation about Samantha's heart condition and need for a bone marrow transplant was received by Catherine with supernatural calm that surprised Rick, as if she had been subconsciously preparing for exactly this kind of impossible choice during years of struggle for both their survival. When he detailed the risks associated with donation in her current physical condition, including the real possibility of death during the procedure, she listened without interruption or outward demonstration of panic, processing information with forced maturity that came from someone who had regularly faced life or death decisions during an existence marked by extreme deprivation. Her first question was not about her own risks, but about Samantha's chances of survival if she did not proceed with the donation, revealing maternal priorities that placed her daughter's well-being above basic self-preservation. When Rick explained that Samantha would certainly die without the transplant, Catherine's decision was instantaneous and irrevocable, expressed with determination that admitted no argument or further hesitation. "Then there is no real choice," she said simply. "Samantha needs to live, and I am the only person who can ensure that. When can we start the preparations?" The medical preparations for the double surgery began immediately, with a team of specialists mobilized for the complex procedure that required precise coordination between extracting marrow from Catherine and transplanting it to Samantha in adjacent operating rooms. Rick remained by Catherine's side during preoperative examinations that confirmed his worst suspicions about her physical state, revealing severe nutritional deficiencies, chronic anemia, and signs of prolonged physical stress that made any surgery risky. Doctors whispered concerns among themselves about the wisdom of proceeding with donation in such a physically compromised patient. But the urgency of saving Samantha eliminated postponement options that might allow improvement in Catherine's condition. She signed consent forms with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from physical weakness that became more apparent as the day's stress accumulated on a body that had been deprived of adequate nutrition for years. "I'm not afraid to die," she told Rick. "I've died a little every day for 20 years. At least now my death would have meaning. It would save the most important person in the world." It was during the final preparations before Catherine was taken to the operating room that the unexpected tragedy occurred, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of discovering her lost family, facing hospital discrimination, and processing impossible medical decisions in a 24-hour period that had depleted emotional and physical reserves she had been carefully guarding for years. She collapsed without warning while walking toward the preparation room, her small and fragile body crumpling like a rag doll as Rick ran to catch her before she hit the cold hospital floor. Doctors emerged from nearby rooms in response to Rick's screams, forming a circle around the unconscious Catherine, while checking vital signs and administering emergency oxygen. Dr. Thompson took control of the medical situation, ordering immediate tests to determine the cause of the collapse and assess whether she could still be a viable candidate for the surgery that Samantha desperately needed. "Take her for a complete examination immediately," he ordered. "We need to know exactly what we're dealing with before making any decision about proceeding with the procedure." The minutes that followed were pure agony for Rick, who waited in the hallway while doctors examined Catherine in a nearby emergency room, their machines emitting constant beeps that monitored the life that seemed to be slipping through the fingers of people desperately trying to save her. The irony of potentially losing Catherine at the exact moment she was trying to save Samantha was cosmic cruelty, that defied any attempt to find meaning or justice in the universe. Rick walked frantically through the corridor, silently praying to any higher power that might be watching, not to allow his family to be destroyed again by a medical tragedy that was beyond human control. Nurses quickly passed by carrying medical equipment and medications that suggested a critical situation, each urgent movement increasing Rick's anxiety about Catherine's prognosis and implications for Samantha, who was deteriorating in a nearby room while waiting for a transplant that might never happen. "Please," he muttered into the void, "I've already lost Susan and 20 years with Catherine. Don't take her from me now when we finally have a chance to be a real family." Finally, Dr. Thompson emerged from the examination room with an expression that made Rick's blood freeze in his veins, his face carrying the kind of gravity that doctors develop when they need to convey news that will completely devastate families already in crisis. He approached Rick with slow and deliberate steps, clearly struggling to find adequate words for a situation that had transcended normal medical complexity and entered the territory of pure human tragedy. His hands were still trembling slightly from the examinations he had just performed, and Rick could see in his eyes a reflection of the devastation that was about to be communicated. The pause before the final words seemed to last an eternity, suspending Rick in a moment of anticipated terror that was almost unbearable to experience. "She is severely malnourished beyond what we initially imagined," Dr. Thompson finally said, his professional voice failing slightly. "If we operate now, in her current physical condition, there is a very real chance that she will not survive the procedure." Dr. Thompson's statement about the risks of Catherine not surviving the surgery created a moment of absolute silence in the corridor, where the only audible sound was the distant hum of medical equipment and Rick's irregular breathing, trying to process yet another impossibility in a series of cruelties that seemed to determine his family's fate. Medical logic dictated that the procedure should be postponed until Catherine strengthened, but the reality of Samantha rapidly deteriorating eliminated the luxury of time that such improvement would require. Rick felt trapped between two equally devastating choices: proceed with surgery that could kill Catherine, or wait for improvement that would allow Samantha to die before receiving necessary treatment. It was in this moment of absolute despair that inspiration was born from paternal love and the memory of how Susan had sacrificed everything to try to save their daughters 2 decades before. "What if we transfuse my blood to Catherine first?" he suddenly asked. "My blood is healthy, well-nourished, full of resources that hers doesn't have. We can strengthen her using my own vitality." Dr. Thompson considered Rick's proposal with initial skepticism that gradually gave way to medical curiosity as he explored the possibilities of emergency blood transfusion as a method to strengthen a critically weak patient before major surgery. The procedure was not without precedent. Although it was rarely used in circumstances where donor and recipient were related and facing simultaneous surgeries that could compromise both. Risks included the possibility of Rick becoming too weak to function as emotional support during both patients' recovery, but the potential benefits of infusing nutrient-rich blood into Catherine's system could give her the necessary safety margin to survive the bone marrow donation. After quick consultation with other specialists, Dr. Thompson agreed to attempt experimental procedure, although he warned there were no guarantees that the transfusion would be sufficient to eliminate risks associated with years of chronic malnutrition that had affected Catherine's vital organs. "It's our best available option," he admitted, "but even with transfusion, she will be facing significant risks. This is untested medical territory." The blood transfusion from Rick to Catherine was performed in special procedure room where both remained conscious during process that lasted almost 2 hours, allowing intimate conversation between father and daughter that had been interrupted by 20 years of forced separation. Rick felt life force flowing from his body to hers through tubes connecting their circulatory systems, creating literal physical connection that symbolized the emotional reunion they had experienced since meeting in the storm. Catherine remained awake during the procedure, holding Rick's hand with increasing strength as his blood strengthened a body that had been functioning on empty reserves during years of extreme deprivation. Colors gradually returned to her pale face, and tremors that had been constant since her collapse began to diminish as adequate nutrition finally reached cells that had been deprived for so long. "I feel as if I'm waking from a very long dream," she said, "as if I'm finally becoming real after years of existing as a ghost of myself." Tests conducted after transfusion showed significant improvement in Catherine's vital signs, with blood pressure stabilized, hemoglobin levels elevated, and organ functions demonstrating increased resources that could sustain surgical trauma necessary for bone marrow donation. Dr. Thompson expressed cautious optimism about her chances of surviving the procedure, although warning that considerable risks still remained associated with surgery on someone who had spent decades in chronic malnutrition. Rick, on the other hand, felt significant weakness after losing substantial amount of blood, but insisted on remaining conscious and present during Catherine's surgery to offer emotional support she would need during the most critical moment of her life. Doctors reluctantly agreed, setting up monitors for Rick that would alert if his own condition became dangerous during prolonged procedure that would either save or destroy what remained of his family. "Everything will be fine," Rick whispered to Catherine as she was prepared for surgery. "Susan is watching over us, ensuring our family is finally reunited the way it was meant to be." The dual surgery was performed in adjacent rooms, with connected doors that allowed constant communication between medical teams, monitoring both patients whose lives were interconnected through procedure that would save one using sacrifice from the other. Catherine's bone marrow extraction lasted 3 tense hours, during which Rick remained in semi-conscious state in recovery room, his own weakness increased by blood loss, but mitigated by determination to remain alert to provide support Catherine would need upon awakening. Samantha was simultaneously prepared to receive transplant that represented last hope for complete recovery, her small body connected to machines that would maintain vital functions during delicate procedure, requiring perfect timing between donation and transplant. Dr. Thompson coordinated both surgeries with precision, demonstrating why he was considered among best in his specialty, each decision calculated to maximize chances of success for both patients who had become more than medical cases. They represented family he had nearly destroyed through prejudice and arrogance. "Transplant is progressing perfectly," reported the nurse. "Samantha is responding well and Catherine's vital signs remain stable." The hours following surgery were a period of tense recovery, where 3 generations of the family occupied connected hospital rooms, each fighting against different aspects of medical trauma they had faced during procedures that could have resulted in complete loss instead of miraculous recovery. Samantha was first to show signs of improvement, her breathing becoming more regular, as transplanted marrow began working in her weakened system, providing immune defenses that would allow future heart surgery needed to correct congenital defects. Catherine slowly regained consciousness, her first question being about Samantha's condition instead of her own pain from the surgical sites where material necessary to save her daughter's life had been extracted. Rick remained weak but conscious in a nearby chair, monitoring both women who represented everything that mattered in his existence, redefined by the discovery of family he thought he had lost forever. "We did it," he whispered when Catherine finally opened her eyes completely. "Samantha will live, and you will see her grow into the extraordinary woman I know she will be." The recovery period extended for several weeks, during which Rick used all available resources to ensure that Catherine and Samantha received the best possible care available, including specialists brought from other countries and treatments that normal patients would never have access to. During this time, legal procedures were initiated to officially adopt Catherine as a daughter and Samantha as a granddaughter, creating a formal family structure that reflected the emotional bonds that had developed between them during the crisis that brought them together. Catherine slowly regained the strength that transfusion and surgery had allowed her to develop, her body finally receiving adequate nutrition that years of poverty had denied. Samantha's recovery was even more dramatic, her heart surgery successful and her new immune system functioning properly thanks to the marrow donated by her mother. "I finally have a real family," Catherine said during one of her daily visits. "People who love me for who I am instead of rejecting me for what I cannot control." Months after the initial crisis that brought the family together, Rick organized a celebration ceremony in the garden of his mansion, which he had transformed into an appropriate setting for the occasion that marked the official beginning of their lives together as a complete family unit. Catherine wore a reformed version of Susan's wedding dress, alterations making it a perfect fit for her smaller body, while preserving the original beauty that had made Susan radiant on her own wedding day decades earlier. The ceremony was an intimate gathering that included only the medical team that had helped save Samantha, and a few close friends that Rick completely trusted, focusing on the symbolic nature of the reunion instead of a social event that could overwhelm Catherine, who still struggled with self-confidence despite dramatic improvements in her circumstances. Rick walked with Catherine down the improvised corridor in the garden, delivering her in a symbolic gesture that represented acceptance of her as the beloved daughter he had longed for during 20 years of solitude and grief that had defined his existence. "Today marks the beginning of the rest of our lives together," he said during a brief speech. "Family that I thought was lost forever has been restored through a miracle that proves that love truly can conquer anything." Samantha played happily in the garden during the ceremony, her recovery complete, and her spirits high as she ran through flowers that gardeners had planted, especially for the occasion that celebrated her own survival, along with the reunion of a family that had been separated by decades of misunderstandings and tragedy. Her scar from heart surgery was small and would disappear with time, but the scar on Catherine's forehead remained a prominent reminder of the journey that had brought them together through a series of impossible coincidences that defied rational explanation. Instead of trying to hide the mark that had caused so much humiliation during her youth, Catherine now wore it proudly as a symbol of genetic connection with Susan that had made recognition possible during the storm that changed everything for all of them. "My scar is not a curse," she told Samantha during a quiet moment in the garden. "It's a blessing that brought us to Daddy Rick when we needed him most. Sometimes the things that make us different are exactly what save our lives." The final scene of the ceremony happened during sunset, when Rick presented Catherine with keys to the wing of the mansion that would permanently be hers, along with a trust fund that would ensure that neither she nor Samantha would face poverty again during their lives. But more important than financial security was the emotional security that came from knowing that they belonged somewhere permanently, that they were valued and loved unconditionally by a person who had the resources and will to protect them from hardships that had defined their previous existence. Catherine accepted the gifts with tears of gratitude, not for the money itself, but for the security and acceptance it represented. Proof that she was truly a wanted member of the family instead of a burden that could be discarded when circumstances changed. "Thank you for believing in me," she said to Rick, "and for giving me the chance to be the daughter I always wanted to be. Our family may be small, but it's filled with more love than I thought possible to experience." Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and check out the next one waiting for you here on the screen. I'll wait for you there.